Hello, family. I trust that this finds all of you well. Today, I want to share or begin a six-part series on a topic: how to handle crises in life. And I'm sure it goes without saying that we all are dealing or going through some major crises right now in each of our lives, wherever you may be watching from, what part of the world you may be. We all are experiencing some type of crises. And I want to share some principles from one of my favorite books, which is the Bible. I often go to the Bible to glean some wisdom when I'm going through any type of crisis. And I want to share a story that I'm sure some of you may already be familiar with. And it's from the book of 1 Samuel chapter 30. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but if you have time and you have a Bible, read the story, and I think it'll bring a lot of wisdom and perspective to what we're going through right now in the world. And this story talks about David. David was a man. David killed Goliath. I'm sure you're all familiar with David. David was a man after God's own heart. God loved David because of who he was, right? And so this story says David and his men had arrived home at their town called Ziklag, and they found that their enemies, the Amalekites, had made a raid into the town and had crushed the town and burned it down to the ground. They had carried off the women and the children and everyone else without killing anyone. And so the story goes on to say that when David and his men saw the ruins and realized what had happened to their families, they wept until they could no longer weep. They wept until they had no strength in them. And I want to share a lesson. The first lesson today is learning to manage our emotions in crises. This is a six-part series, so we're going to be doing this every day for the next 6 days. But if you could indulge me for a few minutes as I share some lessons here, which I think we're all going to benefit from. The story says David and his men, when they came back and found that their town, the city, was burned, their wives and children had been taken away, all the belongings, everything burned down, reduced to ashes. Think about that for a moment. You're gone, to work, and you come back and your town, your city, your house, and everything reduced to rubble, to ashes. And there were about 600 men, and this story recounts that all of these men wept. They cried and cried until they no longer had any strength in them to cry. And you think about it, there is this popular misconception, if I can put it that way, that men, as men, we can't, or we're not allowed to show emotions. And if you're a man who cries, or if you're a man who weeps, you're called all sorts of names. You're called a wimp, you're called a sissy, you're called all sorts of things. And I did a lesson on this on a previous edition of Time with Fred, where I brought together some of my good friends to talk about men and their emotions. But that's exactly what the story says. That when these men came back and encountered crises, and mind you, this was not a pleasant situation. This was totally unexpected. Is it familiar? It was totally unexpected. It was painful, right? It was unknown. They had no answers. They didn't know why. And they didn't have anything else. So they accepted who they showed the vulnerability by crying. They wept. That was all they could do. They wept and wept and wept until they had no strength in them. The very first step in dealing with crisis, or to help us deal with crises, is to accept or embrace our vulnerabilities. Amidst all of this, COVID-19 disease, which I don't want to focus too much on, but I'm using that as an example because that's one thing that we all are finding as a commonality in the world, right? We're all dealing with various forms of this crisis. There are people whose jobs have been completely taken away. People have lost their jobs. Businesses are suffering. The stock market is plummeting. People are losing money. People are dying. This is a crisis. And so how do we govern ourselves? How do we manage our emotions through this crisis? It's important to learn to embrace your vulnerability. We can't gloss over it. We can't assume, or we can't think positively through this. It's real. right? And as much as we want to stay positive, which I'm going to get to in the next lesson or so, we have to learn to embrace the reality of what we're going through. And that's what David and his men did. These were men, these were strong men, 600 men. But the Bible shares that they cried, they let their guard down, and they wept until they had no strength in them. Why did they do this? Why do I think this is powerful? This is powerful because it comes from a position of strength. And you might say, Fred, how do you say this comes from a position of strength if these men are crying? It comes from a position of strength because they're embracing who they are. They're embracing their vulnerability in the midst of all the others. Right? Typically, would like to shield ourselves. We don't want other people to see how emotionally vulnerable we are, right? We go hide behind the scenes, or we do it in private because we don't want to let our guard down. And oftentimes by doing that, we shroud or we cover our emotions until it gets to a point where it becomes very dangerous. But these men didn't do that. They openly let down their guard and they cried until they had no strength in them. They were very vulnerable. And so the very first lesson I want to share in this 6-part series is when you're dealing with crisis, it is okay to be vulnerable. It is okay to show your emotion. There is a story, which I'm sure some of you again might have heard about, Marriott's CEO, Arne Sorensen. In his message to his employees amidst all this when he was addressing this COVID-19, he had come back from a cancer treatment. He wasn't looking his best. And he did a video, and some of his teammates or his executives were concerned that he was not showing his best self. He was not looking, the best. He was bald. He wasn't looking healthy. And they were concerned that he was showing his vulnerability to the whole world. But that was not what he was trying to do. In the midst of all that, the least of the things he was worried about was how he looked. He wanted to appear vulnerable because he was in this. He wanted to be able to connect and engage with everybody else who was going through or dealing with this crisis. And he won acclaim. His video went viral, and so many people commented on how authentic his leadership was in the way he dealt with this crisis. He was vulnerable. And so how are you dealing with this crisis? Are you upset? Are you hiding your emotions? Do you feel like when you let down your guard, you'll be called all sorts of things, or you'll be called you'll be referred to as someone who is not strong or who is not tough? It is okay to be vulnerable. So the first lesson again in this 6-part series on how to deal with emotions is learning to embrace your emotions, learning to be vulnerable, learning to manage your emotions in a healthy manner. It's okay to grieve. It is a serious pandemic that we're all dealing with. Lives are on the line, finances are on the line, families are on the line. We have to do everything we can to protect our sanity. So it's okay to be vulnerable. So if you're feeling that kind of way, don't shield it. Don't hide your emotions. Don't think that when someone finds out that you're dealing with this in a very hard way, they're going to call. It's okay. It's healthy to be vulnerable. When you're going through crisis, learn to be vulnerable. Learn to manage your emotions. Let it out. And that's what these men did. They cried and cried and cried until they had no strength in them. And what happened next is what I'm going to cover on my next part on learning how to manage crisis. So lesson number 1 for today, learn to be vulnerable. It's okay to be vulnerable. Learn to manage your emotions. Let your guard down. Cry. Talk to someone. Express the way you feel. Sadness, anger, it is okay because it's a crisis. It's unknown, it's unexpected, it's painful and it's hurtful, and it's okay to react that way. Manage your emotions. Be vulnerable. Stay with me and let's find out what happens, or part 2 on what to do when we're going through crisis. Thank you and have a great day.